The fluorescent lights hummed their sterile song as Elena Martinez pushed through the surgical unit doors at 6:47 in the morning, her scrubs still damp from the rain outside. Oak Creek Memorial stretched around her like a living thing, beeping monitors, ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythms, the sharp smell of antiseptic burning her nostrils with every breath. She moved through the corridors with the kind of invisibility that only 6 years of keeping her head down could buy. Nobody watched her. Nobody spoke to her except when they needed something. That was how she wanted it. The faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining brushed against her ribs as she walked, desert tan thread stitched tight over Helmand Province in letters so small only she could feel them. Her hands were steady as she clipped her badge to her waistband, but her fingers lingered on that patch for half a second longer than necessary, a gesture so small and habitual she barely registered it anymore. A helicopter passed overhead in the distance, and her shoulders tightened fractionally. She forced the tension out through her exhale and kept walking. The break room smelled like old coffee and the particular sadness of a hospital cafeteria. Elena unwrapped her lunch, a turkey sandwich and an apple, and sat at the corner table, the one nobody claimed because it faced the wall. She could see the reflection of the room in the darkened window glass. 3 nurses stood by the refrigerator, their voices dropping the moment she sat down. Not whispering exactly. Conversation just seemed to die when her presence registered, the way plants wilt in cold. One of them laughed nervously. Within 20 seconds, all 3 gathered their lunches and drifted toward the back corner table, chairs scraping against tile as they left her to eat alone. Elena bit into her sandwich and chewed with the focused attention of someone who had learned to be alone in rooms full of people. The apple was crisp. The sandwich was tasteless. She had taught herself not to notice these things years ago, the way you stop noticing the hum of a helicopter if you heard it every day. At 6:53, Dr. Hargrove walked into the surgical unit with the kind of presence that made the air pressure change. His leather shoes clicked against the linoleum in a rhythm like a countdown. He was tall, expensive in a way that came from money rather than effort, with the face of someone who had never been told no. His eyes moved across the floor like he was surveying territory. Elena saw him the way she saw everything else, movement in her peripheral vision, a shift in the room's weight. She continued to the medication cart without acknowledging him, her hands moving with the precision that came from muscle memory and years of field work. The chart for Lieutenant Commander Brooks sat open on the computer station, and Dr. Hargrove picked it up, scanning her documentation with the focused intensity of a predator evaluating prey. Elena's handwriting was meticulous, every medication logged with time, dose, route of administration. Nothing sloppy. Nothing that could be questioned. She had learned long ago that documentation was the only language that mattered in a hospital where nobody knew who you really were. She didn't see Hargrove watching her until she was already moving into room for 12, the 14-gauge for catheter prepped in her gloved hands, supplies arranged on the sterile field with the efficiency of someone who had done this thousands of times. The young Navy officer lay in the hospital bed with the restless agitation of someone whose body was healing faster than his mind could process. His right forearm was visible above the blanket, and there, in careful lettering along his bicep, she saw it. A tattoo. Chief Martinez. The letters were smaller than they should be, but they were unmistakably hers. His call sign for her. The rank she carried in her bones but not on any paperwork in this hospital. Elena's hands did not falter. The fore-insertion was smooth, one fluid motion, the catheter seated perfectly in the median cubital vein. She had practiced this movement so many times, under sniper fire in Helmand Province, in the back of a Black Hawk helicopter with rounds tearing through the fuselage, on the cold ground with a tourniquet kit and the weight of another human being bleeding out between her palms. This moment, in a climate-controlled hospital room, was almost easy by comparison. But Lieutenant Commander Brooks did not look at her face. His eyes were fixed on the TV mounted in the corner, and when she finished flushing the line, he spoke without turning his head. "When's my real nurse coming back?" The words landed with the precision of a blade. Elena's jaw tightened for half a second. Not more. The composure held. She had spent 6 years perfecting the art of not reacting to the things people said when they did not know you. When they saw only the white scrubs and not the hands that had carried their brothers out of kill zones. When they registered nursing assistant and not senior chief petty officer. When they looked through you as if you were part of the machinery. Your for is patent and secured, Elena said quietly, her voice the careful product of years of measured breathing. I'll monitor your numbers every hour. She turned to leave, and that was when Dr. Hargrove appeared in the doorway like a man who had been waiting for the exact right moment to make his presence known. His eyes flicked from Brooks to Elena and back again, cataloguing the scene with the intensity of someone watching an equation solve itself. Elena felt her chest tighten. A single tear escaped her left eye, not from sadness, but from the sheer pressure of holding everything in. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Hargrove, her hand steady, her face blank. This was her moment to retreat. This was where any other person would have made an excuse and left the room with dignity. But Elena had spent 6 years learning that dignity was a luxury she could not afford. She turned back to the doctor instead, and her voice came out in the controlled register of someone speaking to a superior officer, even though she was not. I've never asked for recognition, doctor. Just the chance to do my job. The words were quiet. They carried the weight of a woman who had held that position not because she wanted it, but because someone had to. Because in Helmand Province, when the convoy ahead hit an IED and the radio filled with static and screaming, there was no such thing as a real nurse or a lesser nurse. There was only the person willing to run into the fire. Dr. Hargrove's expression did not change, but something flickered behind his eyes, a recognition, maybe, or the first cold calculation that Elena Martinez was not going to be as easy to dismiss as he had thought. He closed the chart slowly. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects in a jar. Nobody spoke. The heart monitor beeped its steady rhythm, 72 beats per minute, a sinus rhythm strong and true, the kind of sound Elena had learned to interpret before she could read. But that wasn't the worst part. The heart monitor beeped its steady rhythm, 72 beats per minute, a sinus rhythm strong and true. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what Dr. Hargrove did 47 minutes later. Elena was restocking the supply cart at the nurse's station when she heard the sound, rubber soles on linoleum, Hargrove's shoes with their expensive Italian leather, clicking toward the unit bulletin board. She didn't look up. She'd learned not to look up. But she listened. She'd learned to do that too, the way she'd learned to listen for incoming mortars in Helmand Province, body tensed, ears attuned to the smallest shift in air pressure that meant something terrible was coming. Hargrove pinned a single sheet of paper to the board using a brass pushpin. The sound was small. Deliberately audible. Elena felt 3 other nurses glance in her direction. She continued counting gauze pads, 4x4 sterile sponges in their individually wrapped packages, her fingers steady, her movements precise as a surgical robot. Nurse Stephanie walked past the bulletin board 15 seconds later. Elena heard the intake of breath, the whisper that followed Martinez, failure to follow chain of command. Stephanie's voice carried the particular pleasure of someone delivering bad news. What did she do? Another nurse asked. I don't know exactly, but it's up there for everyone to see. Dr. Hargrove made sure of that. Elena didn't move. Her hands continued their inventory, counting and rest-tacking, as if the physical act of organization could anchor her to something solid. The disciplinary notice was visible from where she stood without looking directly at it. She could read it in her peripheral vision, printed in Hargrove's careful block letters, posted on the unit board where the entire department would see it before lunch, before shift change, before the day nurses gave report to the night shift. Before the world knew Elena Martinez was a failure. Fascinating, isn't it? Hargrove's voice came from behind her, smooth as whiskey poured over ice. How some people seem to question every physician's clinical judgment. Every supply order. Every decision made by people with significantly more experience. He had brought Dr. Chen, a resident, with him. She recognized the setup. Hargrove was building a narrative in front of witnesses. Elena turned to face him, her jaw set in that particular angle that had once made a major general notice her from 50 meters away and know she wouldn't break. I've never questioned your qualifications, doctor. Just ensured accurate inventory. Supply discrepancies cost the hospital $17,000 last quarter alone. How interesting that you track such things, Hargrove said, his smile like a knife turning in a lock. Perhaps we could discuss this at a later time when you might have time to reflect on the chain of command. He turned to Dr. Chen. Some nurses believe their role includes second-guessing physician judgment. A dangerous assumption, wouldn't you agree? Dr. Chen nodded uncertainly. She was 26, for months into residency, her face pale under fluorescent lights that made everyone look like they were being prepared for autopsy. Elena's breath came measured and slow. 1, 2, 3. She'd used the same counting technique to stay alive in an ambush at Helmand Province in 2016, when she was something other than a supply-counting nurse, when her hands had done things that still visited her in the 3 a.m. darkness. She didn't tremble. She didn't blink. She said, "Yes, doctor," and returned to her inventory. Hargrove's smile faded. He'd expected something, a protest, tears, defensiveness. Something he could use. Instead, he'd received compliance so perfect it felt like contempt. By Thursday afternoon, the reassignment came through. Elena was pulled from surgical cases and assigned to the med-surg floor, the medical surgical ward where patients recovered from routine procedures, where the work was monotonous and the stakes were low. Her name was removed from the critical care rotation. Her access to the operating rooms was revoked. The official reason cited in her personnel file was procedural violations requiring remediation. The real reason was that Hargrove needed her invisible, powerless, documented as a nurse who couldn't follow orders. That same day, Elena learned that surgical supply orders were being redirected. The hospital's regular vendor, Midwest Medical Solutions, was being replaced by a new supplier, Nova Medical Group, owned by a company registered to an address in Delaware that traced back, through 3 layers of LLC incorporation, to Hargrove's brother-in-law. The cost increase was approximately 32%. Nobody questioned it. Nobody audited the numbers. Nobody noticed that Hargrove had signed off on the new contracts without the required committee approval. Elena noticed. Her precision with numbers was the same precision that had kept her alive in Helmand, reading angles, calculating distances, understanding that one miscalculation meant death. She noticed the supply cost increases. She noticed the discrepancies in the surgical inventory logs. She noticed that Hargrove had written her up 3 times that week for minor infractions, improper labeling of a specimen, a medication dispensed 5 minutes after the scheduled time, a question asked during rounds when she should have remained silent. Each write-up was dated and documented, building a file that made Elena look incompetent. Each write-up was also carefully timed to follow supply order discrepancies of thousands of dollars, the small infractions creating a smokescreen over the larger theft. She said nothing. She documented her concerns in a separate notebook, handwritten and dated, her military training recognizing the shape of an investigation before it started. But she said nothing to anyone at Oak Creek Memorial. Friday morning, Elena was assigned to room for 12. Lieutenant Commander Brooks was recovering from a vascular repair, his wound healing well, his vitals stable. His wife was there, sitting in the vinyl chair beside his bed, her hands folded in her lap. She watched Elena approach with the medication cart, a careful, evaluating look that suggested she'd already made judgments about competence based on what she'd heard in the halls. "When will his real nurse arrive?" she asked. Not hostile, just matter of fact. Someone with more experience. Elena's hands were steady as she checked the 4 line. "I have 16 years of critical care experience. Your husband is receiving excellent care." 16, the wife repeated. Dr. Hargrove said. She stopped. Behind her, in the doorway, Hargrove appeared with his coat already on, preparing for the weekend. "Mrs. Brooks, I assure you Nurse Martinez has all the qualifications necessary for basic medication administration," he said, his tone making it clear that basic meant minimal. "Though given the complexity of your husband's case, perhaps we should assign someone with additional credentials. Stability is critical in recovery, wouldn't you agree? Some nurses are simply more suited to routine care." The word hung in the air like a weapon he'd set down carefully on the nightstand. Stability. implying Elena was unstable. Building the narrative one small implication at a time. Elena hung the 4 bag, checking the drip rate, confirming the medication, 10 milligrams midazolam for pain management. Her hands moved with muscle memory, the same steady hands that had once performed field medicine in a firefight, that had packed an arterial wound with gauze and kept a man alive for 300 meters under sniper fire. Those hands were shaking now, but only the tiniest tremor, visible only if someone knew what to look for. She looked up to meet Hargrove's eyes. He smiled. It was the smile of someone who knew he was winning. The break room at noon was a study in orchestrated isolation. Elena sat with her salad and thermos of coffee at a table alone, near the corner by the outdated microwave that smelled like 15 years of reheated spaghetti. Nurse Stephanie gathered her lunch the moment Elena sat down. The charge nurse excused herself. 2 others who had once asked Elena for advice about their own patients suddenly became very interested in the refrigerator, moving bottles of yogurt from one shelf to another with the concentration of people diffusing explosives. The room went dead silent except for the sound of Elena's fork scraping plastic, a rhythm like a metronome marking time. The wall clock above the refrigerator ticked audibly, each second a small punctuation mark in her isolation. Hargrove entered precisely at 12:17 p.m. He poured coffee with the air of a man completely unbothered, surveying the room with the casual observation of a naturalist watching animals in their habitat. Interesting how some people inspire confidence, he said to no one in particular, and others don't. There are studies on it, actually. Personality types that simply don't mesh with team dynamics. He passed her table on the way out. Better check your inventory, clipboard. I'd hate for you to miss a band-aid. Elena finished her salad in exactly 6 minutes. She rinsed her container, placed it in the recycling bin, and returned to work without a word. But her eyes had changed, had shifted from the careful neutrality of someone trying to survive into something else entirely. Something that made the air in the room feel different in a way no one could quite identify. It was the look of a senior chief petty officer who'd just finished calculating odds. The orderly burst through the trauma room doors with the stretcher moving at a near run, and the sound was all wrong for a wet, irregular gasping that didn't match any rhythm Elena recognized. Lieutenant Commander Brooks was seizing, his body arching against the restraints, his skin the color of concrete. His chest heaved upward on the left side, hyper-expanded and rigid, while the right side barely moved at all. Cyanotic. Asymmetrical breathing. The ventilator was still pushing air into him, but something had collapsed inside. A tension pneumothorax doesn't announce itself politely. It announces itself by stealing oxygen 1 second at a time while the patient's eyes roll back and his oxygen saturation plummets like a stone down a well. Elena moved before the code team was called. She didn't wait for Dr. Hargrove to authorize anything or for someone higher in the chain of command to make the decision. She moved the way a senior chief moves when there's no time for hierarchy, hands already reaching for the crash cart, fingers finding the 14-gauge needle with the same muscle memory that had guided her through firefights in Sanjin Valley where the margins between life and death were measured in heartbeats. The charge nurse was still reaching for the phone. Elena had already prepped the site, already located the second intercostal space, already knew exactly where the needle needed to go. Midclavicular line. Into the chest. Between the ribs where you could feel the anatomical landmarks even through blood-soaked scrubs. She didn't ask permission. She didn't wait for orders. She pressed the needle in. The hiss was immediate, a rush of pressurized air escaping like someone had opened a valve in Brooks's chest. The sound filled the room, sharp and definitive, and it was the most beautiful sound Elena had ever heard because it meant the pressure that had been crushing his lung was collapsing into the room instead of into his body. His oxygen saturation was 54 when she pushed the needle in. The monitor climbed as she pulled the needle back, leaving the catheter in place to keep the seal open. 62, 71, 81, 88. The color in his face changed from gray concrete to something almost human again. His body stopped fighting the ventilator. His pupils constricted back to normal. The seizing stopped. Sinus rhythm held steady on the monitor, a rhythm that had almost stopped existing 30 seconds ago. The trauma team was just arriving when the commotion started in the hallway. Elena heard it first, a voice screaming something about malpractice, about incompetence, about my sister married an incompetent, followed by the sound of someone shoving through the doors with the kind of violence that came from chemical courage and chemical rage. Marcus Chen, according to the chart, Brooks's brother-in-law, high on methamphetamine and waving a knife that caught the fluorescent light like it was alive. He was screaming at Brooks. At Elena. At the ventilator. At a medical system he thought had failed his family. The knife was a 6-inch blade, serrated, the kind used for camping or hunting, and he held it the way someone holds a weapon when they've never been trained but have watched enough television to think they know what they're doing. Mrs. Brooks screamed. A nurse backed toward the corner. The security call went out, but Norfolk Police Department was responding from 3 blocks away, ETA for minutes minimum. 300 seconds. An eternity. Marcus lunged at Brooks. He actually lunged at a sedated, intubated officer lying motionless on a hospital bed, and something inside Elena, something that had been buried beneath 6 years of scrubs and isolation and measured breathing, woke up. She stepped between the blade and the patient without thinking. Thought is a luxury combatants don't have. She just moved, her body remembering the logic of Helmand Province where the only rule was that the wounded stayed alive. The knife came up. She saw the trajectory the way a chess player sees 5 moves ahead, and she didn't try to block it or dodge it. She did something far more efficient. She moved into the strike instead of away from it, rotating her shoulder so the blade hit the muscle instead of the vital structures underneath. The knife went in maybe an inch deep, glancing off something hard, bone, probably her scapula, and the pain was bright and electric and utterly secondary to the mission. Protect the patient. Neutralize the threat. The second strike came immediately, a follow-up slash aimed at her midsection, and Elena was already rotating her hips, already using the biomechanics of leverage instead of strength. The blade opened a 4-inch laceration across her ribs. She felt the skin separate, felt the muscle tear underneath, felt the warmth of blood that wasn't running, it was flooding. Her vision tunneled at the edges, not from fear but from adrenaline, from the neural reallocation of blood flow to muscles instead of peripheral vision. She locked both of Marcus's wrists with the precision of someone who'd been trained by the best hand-to-hand combat instructors in the United States Navy. One hand over the knife hand. The other gripping his opposite wrist for leverage. Then she did what she'd been drilled to do 1,000 times. She drove him into the wall using his own momentum against him. Not strength. Biomechanics. Physics. He hit the drywall hard enough to crack it, hard enough to drive the air from his lungs. He was gasping. The knife dropped. Elena held him pinned until she heard the sound of boots on tile, security arriving from the ground floor, moving fast, moving purposeful. She released him. She looked at Brooks still breathing steadily on the ventilator, still stable, still alive. She heard her own voice, steady and level, saying, "Patient is stable." She sounded like a senior chief. She sounded like someone who'd seen worse. She sounded like someone who'd already calculated the cost of this moment and decided it was worth paying. Then she turned and walked into the hallway before anyone could see the edges of her vision going dark. She made it maybe 20 feet before her body decided she wasn't moving anymore. She leaned against the wall, her hand pressed to her ribs, and she felt her blood seeping between her fingers in warm rivulets. The hallway was very quiet. The ventilator hissed in the room behind her. Somewhere above on the 3rd floor, a phone was ringing. Mrs. Brooks was crying, a sound like something breaking repeatedly. Elena closed her eyes and measured her breathing the way she'd been taught in field medicine training. In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. The pain was information. Pain was data. Pain was her nervous system telling her that the vessel damage was manageable, that the bleeding was surface level, that she could move if she needed to move. She didn't need to move. Not yet. Dr. Patel found her there and didn't ask questions that needed asking. He just brought her to the ER bay, his hand steady as he cut away her scrubs, his voice careful as he said, "This needs 8 stitches. Maybe 10. The shoulder wound was glancing, shallow, already clotting. The rib wound was the one that needed attention. She lay on the stretcher while Dr. Patel irrigated both wounds with normal saline, while he threaded sutures through her skin with the kind of focus that meant he understood exactly how close the blade had come to creating a different outcome. "Pain medication?" he asked, needle poised. "Tylenol," Elena said. "That's not Tylenol. I don't take opioids." Dr. Patel didn't push. He finished the sutures in silence, and Elena didn't flinch once, didn't ask for anything stronger than what she'd requested. Opioids had been the beginning of something dangerous 3 years ago when the VA first diagnosed her with PTSD, when the pills came home in brown bottles with instructions to take as needed. She'd flushed every one of them down the toilet in October 2017. Some things you don't go back to. She was still in the ER bay, her upper body wrapped in gauze that was already starting to show through with the faintest hint of blood seepage, when Dr. Hargrove made his first call. She heard him in his office, voice smooth as oil, speaking to Gerald Whitmore, the hospital board chairman whose son Hargrove had mentored through medical school. "Gerald, we have a liability situation. A nurse performed an invasive procedure without authorization, a needle decompression, and then physically engaged with a patient's family member. I need you to understand the risk exposure we're looking at. It's significant." The tone was concern. The subtext was damage control. The second call came 20 minutes later. Elena heard that one too, because the hospital hallway that connected the ER to the administrative offices was thin-walled and quiet in the late afternoon. A state licensing board investigator. Someone who apparently owed Hargrove a favor from a malpractice case where Hargrove had testified as an expert witness. She escalated a situation that should have been de-escalated, Hargrove said, his voice carrying the weight of a man delivering bad news about someone he'd been hoping would prove her worth. Possible hero complex. Unstable employee. I'm concerned about her judgment, frankly. The third call was to risk management at 4:02 p.m., according to the timestamp Elena would see later. By 5:15 p.m., there was an envelope in her locker. White. Official looking. The words printed in the kind of font that only appears on documents that end careers, immediate termination for reckless endangerment and practicing medicine beyond scope of licensure. Elena sat on the bench in the locker room and held the letter in both hands, and she didn't scream, didn't crumple it, didn't do any of the things that a person with something to lose would do. She just read the words that were designed to erase everything she'd built here, 6 years of invisible excellence, 6 years of becoming the kind of nurse who could perform a needle decompression in her sleep, 6 years of walking these corridors like a ghost because being visible had always been dangerous. She folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. Then she changed out of her blood-stained scrubs and walked out of Oak Creek Memorial without talking to anyone, without defending herself, without doing anything except exist in the space between the person she'd been and the person she was about to become. The ER doctor, someone Elena had trained 3 years ago, glanced at her shoulder bandage and looked away. Professional distance. The kind that meant everyone already knew. The sterile field where she'd just been sutured felt like a confession chamber, the needle entry points on her shoulder and ribs burning as the local anesthetic wore off, her scrub still damp with rust-brown blood that wouldn't come clean. 23 stitches across her ribs. 12 more in her shoulder. The attending had offered her morphine. She'd declined. Pain was information. Pain meant she was still functioning, still thinking, still moving. The locker room was empty when she changed into her street clothes. She stood alone between the metal lockers, listening to the ambient hum of the building's ventilation system like a ship's hull groaning in deep water. Her uniform shirt lay crumpled on the bench, bloodstains spreading across the front like a map of where she'd failed to protect herself. She'd been trained to stop threats, not to bleed in front of people who already despised her. The envelope was taped to her locker door. Not hand-delivered. Not addressed to her personally. Just an envelope with Elena Martinez in typewritten font, the coward's method of communication. Termination of employment. Effective immediately. Elena read it twice, her eyes tracking each paragraph with the same methodical precision she used to read EKG strips. The language was surgical, reckless endangerment, practicing beyond scope of practice, failure to follow chain of command, creating a hostile work environment through escalation of a violent incident. Every word had been chosen by someone who'd already spoken to a lawyer. The signature at the bottom belonged to Gerald Whitmore, hospital board chairman. But the real authorship was clear. Hargrove had drafted this. Hargrove had orchestrated the timing, the moment when she was stitched up and vulnerable and alone. She folded the letter carefully. The paper felt heavier than it should. 6 years of showing up early. 6 years of never taking a sick day. 6 years of building a life where nobody knew her name. Gone in the time it took a lawyer to type a memo. Nurse Stephanie entered the locker room and froze. Their eyes met for exactly 2 seconds. Stephanie's gaze dropped to the bandage visible at Elena's neck. Then she turned and walked back out without a word, her footsteps echoing down the corridor like a closing door. The drive home took 17 minutes. Elena's right hand gripped the steering wheel at 9 o'clock, her left arm immobilized against her body. Every turn sent a spike of pain through her ribs, sharp, demanding, the kind of pain that made breathing something to negotiate rather than something automatic. She drove with the precision of someone who'd learned to operate through injury, who understood that showing weakness in front of witnesses meant becoming a target. The rental house on Chesapeake Avenue was small. A 3-bedroom colonial that had absorbed 30 years of other people's lives before Elena and David moved in 6 years ago. She'd chosen it for the single feature that mattered, the quiet back bedroom with a lock on the door and a window overlooking the water where she could see anything approaching. Military instinct translated into civilian domestic architecture. It was 2:56 p.m. when she sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she didn't drink. Sunlight slanted through the window at an angle that meant early spring. The house was silent except for the refrigerator's hum, another mechanical rhythm like her own breathing, like the ventilators at the hospital, like the steady percussion of her own heartbeat refusing to accelerate despite everything. The nightmare had happened 6 years ago. She'd been lying in the base hospital at Bagram, her spine wrapped in bandages, shrapnel fragments still embedded in places the surgeons had marked as inoperable, and she'd woken at 3 in the morning understanding that the silence would kill her before the wounds did. She'd put in her resignation papers 2 weeks after discharge. Senior Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez had become just Elena, a woman who worked nights and kept her head down and raised her son without telling him why she flinched at fireworks or why the 4th of July meant sleeping in the car. David was supposed to be at school. He had calculus at 2 o'clock on Wednesdays. Elena had always calculated her shifts around his schedule, never working days that would leave him unsupervised, never allowing her life to interfere with the fiction that they were normal. He found her sitting at the table at 2:58 p.m., staring at nothing, the termination letter visible on the surface in front of her like evidence at a crime scene. "Mom." His voice was careful. He'd learned early how to read her silences. "Why aren't you at work? What happened?" Elena wiped her face. The motion sent another spike through her ribs, sharp enough that she inhaled too quickly and paid for it. She tried to compose an answer. The words wouldn't come. There was no civilian explanation that would make sense to a 16-year-old who'd grown up believing his mother was simply a night shift nurse with a quiet personality and an aversion to crowds. "They let me go, baby. I made a mistake." David picked up the letter. His eyes tracked the paragraphs with the same precision Elena had used. He read it twice, slow, careful, the way she'd taught him to approach any document that mattered. "This says you saved someone's life. How is that a mistake?" Elena couldn't explain the arithmetic of institutional corruption. Couldn't explain that she'd noticed the pattern 3 weeks ago, surgical supply orders running at exactly 237% of normal volume, high-end equipment kits ordered in quantities that made no clinical sense, every shipment routed through a company called MedSupply Solutions registered to a Maryland address owned by a man named Patrick Hargrove. Couldn't explain that her charting habits made her dangerous, that her documentation of what arrived versus what was actually delivered created a trail of evidence that pointed directly at her boss's brother-in-law and by extension upward. Couldn't explain that she'd been about to file a report with the compliance officer when the knife came through and everything became tactical, everything became survival, everything became expendable. Sometimes doing the right thing costs everything. Elena's voice was steady. The composure she'd built across 2 decades didn't break. You don't understand yet. But you will. David stared at her for a long moment. His face carried the architecture of her own face, high cheekbones, dark eyes, the kind of gravity that made him seem older than 16. Finally, he set the letter down on the table and turned away. I'm going upstairs. Elena assumed he was angry. She didn't know he was walking to the attic access, climbing the pull-down ladder, navigating the insulation and the boxes they'd packed 6 years ago when they'd moved to Norfolk, boxes she'd labeled with military efficiency, boxes she'd told him never to open. She didn't know he was searching through the archive of his mother's previous life, looking for something he'd glimpsed once when they were unloading the moving truck, a shadow box wrapped in brown paper, his mother's hand shaking as she carried it upstairs. The uniform shirt was still in the laundry basket when Elena finally moved. The blood had oxidized to brown, the stain now permanent, the fabric something she'd never wear again. She held it up to the light and understood that some things couldn't be cleaned. Some things could only be discarded. The fluorescent lights of the ER faded from her vision as she closed her eyes. In their place came the memory of Helmand Province, not the firefight, not the IED, not the sniper round snapping overhead. Just the weight of Lieutenant Commander Brooks across her shoulders, his blood mixing with her blood, her voice saying the things that needed to be said to keep him conscious. Stay with me. I've got you. Stay with me. She'd thought she'd left that version of herself in the desert. She'd thought 6 years of invisibility meant she'd finally buried Senior Chief Martinez in the same grave where she'd buried her sidearm. That wasn't the worst part. The worst part was realizing that anonymity had never been a choice. It had only ever been a form of surrender. David found the shadow box at 2:30 in the afternoon, wedged behind winter coats in the attic of their Norfolk home, and he didn't understand what he was looking at until his hand stopped shaking enough to open the lid. Bronze star. Purple heart. Purple heart again. His mother's name engraved on the back of each one in letters so small he had to squint to read them. He'd been looking for proof that she wasn't crazy, that the crying at the kitchen table meant something other than a breakdown, and instead he found evidence of a war his mother had never mentioned, medals that caught the fluorescent light like accusations when he walked into Oak Creek Memorial's administrative wing the next morning carrying the shadow box like a bomb. Patricia Chen, the hospital administrator, was in a meeting with the legal team when David appeared in her doorway. She glanced up, irritated at the interruption, and her irritation turned to confusion when she saw the 17-year-old boy with his mother's dark eyes holding an open shadow box. He didn't wait for permission to speak. His voice came out steady, the way a person sounds when they've rehearsed something in the mirror 17 times. Your nurse is Senior Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez. The words landed like artillery fire. Patricia's pen stopped moving. The hospital's lawyer looked up from his laptop. David opened the box wider, let the medals catch the light again. She saved a man's life 48 hours ago. And you fired her for it. Elena was supposed to be at home, away from the building that had become a tomb of fluorescent lights and whispered conversations. But David had texted her, just 3 words, come to the hospital, and something in his tone made her ignore the 3-day-old stitches in her shoulder and the way her ribs ached when she breathed. She arrived in the administrative wing as Patricia Chen was dialing the security office, as the lawyer was pulling up a government database with hands that moved too fast, and when Elena stepped into the conference room, she found her own name displayed across multiple screens. Her service file. Her promotions documented year by year. Her discharge papers from 16 years ago. Her decorations listed in ascending order of prestige, and she felt her breath catch, not from surprise, but from the weight of suddenly having the thing you buried pressed back into your hands in fluorescent light in front of strangers. 2 bronze stars. The first one glowed in the monitor light, action in Helmand Province, 2009, leadership under fire. The second one, leadership in combat operations, 2011. Patricia's lawyer scrolled down. Purple heart. Elena's hands trembled as she read the citation, shrapnel wound to the left shoulder, continued mission performance. And then a second purple heart. Wound to the left leg, evacuation recommended, declined evacuation. Elena heard her own breathing, steady and controlled, the kind of breathing you learn in the first week of Navy training when panic is the thing that kills you faster than bullets. She looked at David. He was crying. She did not cry. She simply read the words on the screen as if they belonged to someone else, someone she used to know in another lifetime. The door opened and a man in dress uniform stepped through, and Elena knew him before he spoke. Commander Reeves. Former SEAL team leader. Former commanding officer. She'd carried him out of a kill zone in Sanjin Valley while rounds snapped overhead like angry hornets, and he'd lost his left eye to shrapnel but gained a Navy Cross on his uniform jacket that he wore like a memory he refused to forget. He stood at the end of a conference table and looked at Elena across the distance of 6 years and countless surgeries and the wall she'd built around herself, and his remaining eye was the color of the Afghan sky right before dawn. Bronze Star for action in Helmand Province, 2009. His voice was the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Bronze Star for leadership under fire, 2011. He paused, let the weight settle. Purple Heart for shrapnel wounds sustained during evacuation operations. Another pause. Longer this time. And a Navy Cross for action in a kill zone near Sanjin, where you extracted me and 2 others from a burning Humvee, then turned around and went back into the LZ to retrieve the corpsman. Commander Reeves moved closer to the monitor. Medic said you took shrapnel to your spine during the return run. You went back anyway. An FBI agent stepped into the room like a shadow that had been waiting in the hallway for exactly this moment. Her name was Torres, and she carried a laptop like a weapon. She didn't smile. She opened the laptop and turned the screen toward Dr. Hargrove's empty chair. He'd tried to leave 15 minutes earlier, but Agent Torres had simply blocked the doorway and said, "We need you to stay, Doctor." Now she gestured at the monitor. "We've been investigating the supply fraud for 3 months. Med Supply Solutions, the brother-in-law's company, the inflated orders, the diverted contracts worth $480,000. The door opened again. The hospital's IT specialist, Sergeant Davis, a Marine who'd served 12 years before joining the civilian world, entered with a secondary laptop. He was carrying the kind of evidence that ends careers. Dr. Hargrove attempted to delete security footage from the night Ms. Martinez was stabbed. Davis's voice was mechanical, the voice of someone who'd learned to report facts without emotion. For deletion attempts between midnight and 3 a.m. The footage showed Lieutenant Commander Brooks's attack, showed the assault, showed Ms. Martinez's actions in real time. He tried to erase every frame. Davis turned the secondary laptop around. "I saved everything. I also saved the access logs showing his credentials used during the deletion attempts. Timestamps. Metadata. All of it." The room went so quiet you could hear the hospital's air systems humming through the vents like a mechanical heartbeat. Patricia Chen's jaw clenched. The lawyer was already making phone calls. Elena stood at the center of the room and felt the thing she'd been carrying for 6 years, the weight of the invisible, finally become visible, finally become real. Someone had seen her. Someone had saved the evidence. Someone had refused to let the erasure be complete. Dr. Hargrove's lawyer arrived and told him to say nothing. But Patricia Chen was already moving through the administrative building like a force of nature, suspending his privileges, ordering security to escort him out, and by noon the State Medical Board had opened an investigation into his credentials. The FBI's case expanded within 48 hours, wire fraud, healthcare fraud, conspiracy, and a Marine gunnery sergeant named Holloway sat in a conference room and told investigators about how 17 complaints from nurses had been filed against Dr. Hargrove over 3 years, all of them dismissed, all of them women who'd noticed supply discrepancies, and none of them had been given a fair hearing. Commander Reeves made a phone call to a contact at the Navy Times. The story ran within a week, Navy Cross recipient fired after saving officer's life, hospital fraud exposed. The headline spread across social media like fire across dry tinder. David recorded a video explaining what happened to his mother and posted it to his Instagram account, and it was shared 37,000 times within 24 hours. Messages flooded in from veterans across the country, people Elena had treated during deployment, people who'd served with her, people who'd heard her name spoken with reverence in the spaces where warriors gathered. 50 combat veterans coordinated travel to Norfolk. Marines, sailors, soldiers, some of them bearing scars that matched Elena's, some of them bearing scars only the invisible kind. They arrived in dress uniforms, ribbons on their chests, decorations earned in the same mountains where Elena had earned hers. They filled the hospital lobby in formation like a wall of gratitude made flesh, and they demanded that Elena Martinez be reinstated and honored. A Marine gunnery sergeant stood in front of Patricia Chen and said the thing that broke her silence: "Chief Martinez pulled me out of a burning Humvee in Sanjin. I have 3 kids because of her. You fired her for doing the same thing she's always done, saving lives." Patricia met with them personally. She shook every hand. She listened to every story. And then she met with Elena in her office, the door closed, and made an offer that came with a title: Director of the Veterans Care Unit. A new facility. A chance to build something instead of hide inside something broken. Elena looked at the contract for 30 seconds, then looked at Patricia. "When do we start?" Her voice had changed. It was lower now, authoritative, the voice of someone who'd finally stopped asking permission and started giving commands. 18 months later, Elena wore her Navy uniform to the ribbon-cutting ceremony at Oak Creek Memorial's new Veterans Care Unit. The 50 combat veterans who'd shown up when David made those phone calls stood in dress uniforms, ribbons catching the morning light, filling the waiting room in a formation that meant something. Lieutenant Commander Brooks stood beside her, his daughter, named Elena, in his wife's arms. Commander Reeves stood at attention. Patricia Chen made a speech that included the word failure and forgive and we should have known. Elena kept the faded Helmand Province unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining where it had been for 6 years, where it would stay forever, and when she stepped up to cut the ribbon, her hands were absolutely steady. If you found this story powerful, subscribe to this channel, and if Elena Martinez represents someone you've met, someone quiet, someone underestimated, someone who shows up when it matters, leave a comment and tell us their story.